Welcome to the Good Growing Podcast. I am Chris Enroth, horticulture educator with the University of Illinois Extension, coming at you from Macomb, Illinois, and we have got a great show for you today. We are going to be talking about growing the grapes in the backyard. Oh, I love some fresh table grapes. But you know I'm not doing this by myself. I am joined, as always, every single week by horticulture educator Ken Johnson in Jacksonville. Hey, Ken.
Hello, Chris. Do you prefer table, raisins, or liquid grapes?
Hmm.
And which kind of
Let's.
liquid grape?
I would say fermented liquid grapes. Um, and I'm not really I'm not very good at tasting wine. I would say I can't distinguish all the different flavors or anything. Um, but I do often know the difference between like this is good wine versus this is not good wine. That's kind of my balance of wine and things. So yes. How about you, Ken? Do you like table grapes? Do you like grape juice, raisins, fermented grapes?
Uh, Table grapes aren't bad. I don't like raisins. Grape juice is good. Fermented grapes, if it tastes like grape juice, that's good. If it doesn't taste
Mhm.
like grape juice, that's not good. So I don't like dry wine.
Oh, sometimes I love dry wine, other times I don't. It just depends on the day, I suppose. And raisins are they getting a bad rap these days? Because I grew up eating lots of raisins. Like that was like a common snack for school, for like all kinds of activities. I don't know if my kids know what a raisin tastes like anymore. I've tried to feed them raisins and they look at it, they're like, what is this?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. We don't. Yeah, we always as kids had raisins in the house, but I don't know if our kids have eaten raisins, but yeah, we don't have like a container full of them sitting around.
Hmm.
So,
Well, my wife she's a dental hygienist and she said, boy, that's not good for your teeth. And so they've always stayed out of the pantry for the most part, even though I still like them. I'll still eat them if I have them.
there you go.
Well, kids aside, I think a lot of folks, we do every once in a while, we get questions about, can I grow my own grapes? And frankly, Ken, that question scares me. There's so much to know when it comes to grape growing. So we have a special guest with us today to cover growing our own backyard grapes. So we have Dr. Elizabeth Wahle in Madison County, Illinois. So that is kind of the Metro East to St. Louis area. So Elizabeth, welcome to the show.
Well, gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here today.
Well, we are happy to have you. And I should add, Elizabeth, you're a commercial ag specialist with our commercial ag team. So you deal a lot with those specialty crops that are grown for sale in a commercial sense, correct?
That's correct. But by
Excellent.
extension, I know how to grow them at home too.
Hmm. So we are really happy to have you here, listeners, viewers. Elizabeth is an absolute wealth of knowledge, everything from those commercial specialty crops to the backyard garden, from ornamentals, vegetable gardens. So we're happy to have you to dive into maybe one of the topics that I am most afraid of here, that is grapes. Um, like I said, there's just a lot to know.
So start off. So we got a whole list of questions here. I'm gonna start off with those. So I guess first question is, what are some things, if somebody wants to grow grapes, what are some things we should consider before we put them in the ground or even buy them?
Well, I'm going to give an answer that I'm not really good at doing myself when, standing in a nursery looking at a plant. But, if I'm putting on my extension hat, I would say for grapes, there's quite a bit of difference in disease susceptibility. And so when you're buying grapes, you really should take the time to look over, the evaluation data on which ones are highly susceptible because, a lot of homeowners, unlike commercial growers, maybe don't have the expertise or the willingness to regularly, apply pesticides to control disease. And so I'm going to say with grapes, probably one of the first things is make sure that you are getting something that reduces the amount of commitment you have with that particular crop in terms of pest control.
That kind of reminds me of like tree fruit in a way. People think they can put that in their backyard and just grow a tree fruit. But grape sounds like a very similar thing where, you have a commitment here for keeping Because things want to eat their grapes and want to infect your grapes.
Yeah, it's, anyone that's hung around with me for a long time says, if we like to eat it, there usually is a lot of other things that like to eat it too. And that's definitely the case with grapes. We have some core diseases. Fortunately, insect pests are not the number one concern. It really is disease. And then when we get into the fruit being there, then we have to worry about all the wildlife that want to steal your crop.
Mhm.
Starting out, make a good decision on what cultivars you're growing.
Well, I guess speaking in line of those cultivars, I always get excited when I visit a vineyard. I'm like, oh, I could do this. Like it makes me like want to do this. They might let you taste some grapes. They might have some wine or something or grape juice that they made, and it makes me excited to do it. But I would be starting from scratch. I would be a beginner. So in terms of like cultivars, varieties, is there anything that is well suited for a beginner? Or like for most of us, we're not going to have acres. We're going to be doing this against a fence, probably in a backyard.
Yeah, I grow grapes myself, and I just have 4 vines. That's all
Mhm.
I have. It's enough. I don't have acres. And I grow a Concord type because I absolutely love, Concord grape. Like most of us, we grew up with, Welch's Cooperative with Concord grape being the baseline for, juices and jellies. So a lot of Americans have a cultivated palate for our American grapes that have that foxiness or that muskiness, a little bit of a tang to it that we don't get with European grapes. And, when I started, I really looked at, what do I want? Do I want a table grape? Do I want something that doesn't have seeds? Do I just want to harvest an entire cluster, and it only serves that one purpose? So you have that group of grapes that you could select from and looking for disease, resistance. But I really wanted something that had more functionality. There are a number of grapes that you can select, and I grow one called Sunbelt, and it's a more southern adapted Concord type. But it can be used for, jams and jellies and juice, and you can make wine out of it. And it's fresh eating. The only drawback for fresh eating is it has seeds in it. But because of its functionality, that's what I selected. And it's not the most disease susceptible, but it's not the best also. But it's within my range of what I'm willing to commit with those grapes. And so that's kind of, how I look at it. How much commitment are you going to have with it? So if you go in knowing how much you're going to, control and really what you want to use for them, I think that really kind of helps you out as a beginner. If you just want table grapes, that kind of really reduces down your choices to what is out there that doesn't have seeds in it. That kind of limits your list, and then you can just start seeing, well, which one has the most, the best flavor and the best disease, profile on there, and that's kind of an easy start.
So a lot of people, I think this is a trend in the horticultural trade is we're getting more towards smaller plants, container type plants. Are there any grapes that would do well in a container setting if you didn't have a lot of space to grow them?
Well, on just about anything, you can get something that doesn't have, as much vigor and is not as big of a vine. And that's some of the ratings that go with grapes. And so you'd want to look for one, that was a less vigorous vine that's not going to be a monster for you to deal with. I will remind everyone that when you're in a container, no matter what, it doesn't stay in that soil or that, the soil in the pot forever. So you always have to think about, how are you going to get it out of the pot and change that soil. So one of the things that I always say when we're talking about food crops that we know, are perennial in nature, don't get a pot that has one of those, reduced neck sizes where it goes in. You really want that straight out so that when you lift the plant up and get the soil off, you can, get it out easily and put it back in. I've been stupid in my life. I think as horticulturists, we can probably all admit that what makes us good at our job is we've done every dumb thing that could possibly be done. And I have done that. I have put pots in those beautiful, vase shape that has the narrow, and then you can't get it out, and you end up having to break the pot, to get the plant out of it. So that's my one comment, is always keep in mind that, we usually say every 2 years, change the soil. You're probably not going to want to do it quite that often. But when you fertilize, make sure that you water very thoroughly to wash, the salts through the soil as much as possible. So the container you select, and plan on where you're going to place it so that it can climb, because it is a true vine. It's going to have something. So whether you put it close to something for it to grab onto, or whether you have a pot large enough that can handle the weight of a trellis that you put down in it, it's going to have something to climb on.
So I know it'll vary on the cultivar and stuff, but how big would I guess a typical grape plant get? Just so people have an idea.
Well, if we're just putting a standard one, I would say that they're probably, maintained about 5 to 6 feet tall, and probably cordons 4 feet either direction. So 8 foot wide, 5 foot tall. And so, if you were able to get a pot, because grapes are actually rather deep rooted, so you're going to have a restricted root system. So I would imagine that you might not be able to get it as large in a container, because of that restricted root um, size space on there. But again, you really have to think about the weight of the plant when it has a crop on it, for tipping over once it's, in fruit. So it's obviously going to have to be attached to something to stabilize it if you've got it in a container.
So we're focusing on Illinois, and we were just before we started recording, we were like going back and forth, reminding each other what zones we were all in. And I was like, "Oh, really? I'm in zone 6B or A." Like, oh my, that like everything's changed a little bit. But for the most part, I know there might be some folks who they might travel to Europe and they see a particular type of grape. They want to, grow something like that over here. But European grapes aren't really necessarily hardy in our part of the world, are they? Like is climate a big deal when selecting these grapes?
It is, I when we look at grapes, we have, I'm going to start with two big groups. So we have the American grapes that are very adapted to our climate, and we have some American grapes that are southern grapes. But European grapes are definitely a more Mediterranean climate and not adapted to our extreme winters. So it's not our spring, summer, and fall, it's the low winter temperatures. And so most of what we call vinifera, so Vitis vinifera, are the European Asian grapes, are not reliably hardy here. Now we have something like Cabernet Franc, which we can grow in the far southern part of the state. So there are a couple of varieties that what we call slightly hardy, but most of them I would rate as tender. And so that probably is, one of the mistakes growers make is, they'll go someplace like California, they'll go up to the Finger Lakes or the Great Lakes, where they have those moderated climates, where they can grow those types of grapes. And then they bring them back home and plant them, and the first winter kills them, to the ground, and they lose them. And one of the things with, vinifera grapes, is they're all grafted. Our European grapes are susceptible to the American phylloxera, which is an insect pest that kills them. And so all vinifera grape worldwide actually are grafted on to American grape rootstock to protect them from the root phase of phylloxera. And so, a lot of people, they'll plant their vinifera grape, it'll be killed to the ground, and what comes back up is not what they planted. It is the rootstock. And that's why it comes back, because it is adapted to our climate. And they end up with, a rootstock type of grape.
So if climate, it plays a big role. Um, I also think about soil. In Southern Illinois, climate and soil, I think, probably play a big role. And I went to school down in Carbondale, Southern Illinois, rolling hills, but red clay, like heavy clay soil. How big of a role does like soil or topography play in grape growing?
Well, I usually relate that it is air drainage that is very important, for spring freezes and so forth, because there's quite a bit of difference in temperature. When we're on a commercial setting, I can easily say, if you're looking for a site, you need to, rolling topography. Well, if I come to my home, it's flat.
Hmm.
We're talking to homeowners. A lot of times that doesn't even come up as an issue because there's no choice. It's like, where's the best site on my property to plant a grape? And so, when you're looking at the best place on your property, when you're not looking at planting acreage, full sun is number one. Um, a well draining soil, and I don't mean sharp drainage, just that they don't like to have wet feet. And so, I have grapes growing on fairly heavy clay, but it is not a wet site. It doesn't sit in water, so it does well. So, a well draining site. Deeper soils are better than shallow. We have some places in the state that have, like hard clay pans or fragipans that have a restrictive zone, and the grapes don't grow as well if you can't get the roots through it, but a deeper soil. But I'm going to say full sun and well drained, not wet feet, like most fruit. They're very similar to most fruit crops. That's what they like.
All right. So if we've got our type of grape that we want, table, wine, what have you, we've picked out our disease resistant cultivar, hopefully. We've got our location, full sun, well draining. When is the best time of year to go plant our grape plants?
Grapes are very much like all plants. Um, you can plant them any time of the year as long as you're providing good conditions, except for probably when the ground is frozen. That's kind of rough. But having said that, it's always best to plant most plants in the early spring. And this is because temperatures are still moderate and they're starting to warm, and there's usually sufficient moisture, and the pest pressure has not, build up strongly at that point, and it kind of gives you a running chance. The second time to plant would be in the fall, again, as temperatures are starting to get cooler at night, the plant's not under as much stress. Um, if you miss those windows, then you always have to think, hmm, is this plant under more stress? So if, instead of planting, in early April, or sometime during April, and I don't go buy my plant, until June 15th, what's different? It's a lot hotter outside, and a lot of times the water has stopped. And so that just kind of locks you in your mind is I need to pay much closer attention to watering this plant. And grapes aren't one that we really worry about sun. There are some plants that we would put temporary shade on. Grapes aren't one of those. So it's mainly, maintaining uniform moisture while they're getting established that's critical.
And I'll say if it's been sitting at the garden center all summer, it probably has not been the best care for it. Sometimes they are, but in a lot of cases, there's a reason they're on sale. They're on clearance.
That's definitely a good point because not only that, they're again in that restricted root environment in a pot. And so they're under stress, just period, being in the pot. And so, when you add to not being cared for, sooner rather than later is the rule for getting them in the ground. Fortunately, grapes are kind of a desirable weed. And I use the word weed in that they grow well. Once they're in a good planting environment.
So let's paint a picture here, and for those listeners, and if you're watching on YouTube, maybe we can find a picture of like what a grape growing plant, what it looks like, because these have to be trellised. Elizabeth, you mentioned like a trunk and like cordons. So could you paint a picture like what are we doing? Like how is this growth habit and what is it being supported with?
Now, I'm going to preface this with that there are entire books written on different training systems. And so I'm going to only talk about one, and it's one that's amenable to most homeowners. So I want to make that clear that they're are way beyond what I'm getting ready to describe. So when we plant a grape, So let's say that you went to the garden center, as Ken says, you go and you buy this potted grape and it has several stems growing out of it. You'll go and plant it. And this is a hard step for a lot of people. I would recommend that you cut away everything down to the shoot that you're going to say, this is the best shoot. Keep 1 or 2 buds on it, remove everything else. And from those 2 buds that need to break and grow, that first year, you're not going to do anything but try to train, one of those canes to go straight up for your trunk. So that first year, your whole goal is to promote as much leaf canopy and growing that up to your top wire. And on a trellis, that's usually between the 5 and 6 foot mark. 5.5 is a good height for it. So that's what your goal is in year 1. In year 2, you should be able to say, this is in fact who's going to be my trunk. Remove everything else that's below. And the idea then is the buds will break. And year 2, you're going to form your cordons and think of them as arms. And one's going to go to the left and one's going to go to the right. And you have to have the trellis wire for which they're going to be, secured to grow long. And those cordons are roughly 4 feet long when said and done. And you don't necessarily lay, just one cane down. What we're looking for is cordons that have buds. Probably, I always use my knuckle, about that different distance between, a bud, the next bud. So if I can do it all along that. So that's year 2. I'm going to form your cordons. And it's in year 3. Grapes are born on buds formed the previous year. And so from those buds that you formed on the cordons, the 3rd year, those will form canes that will fall down, grow down, and that's when you'll get your crop in year 3. So you got 3 years.
So patience is the name of the game.
Yes. Think like asparagus. You don't get food right away. You have to do some stuff first. Good horticulture.
So no, one common issue we get, well, not common, but one issue we get a lot of times with ornamental crops or vegetable crops is herbicide drift damage. And I believe grapes are particularly sensitive, kind of like tomatoes. You whisper herbicide to them and
Yeah,
they
I
get all shriveled up.
sniff. If they even sniff a little bit. Yeah, so they're like red buds, tomatoes. They're just super sensitive to a particular type of herbicide, and those are the growth regulating type. And without going into technical detail, I'm going to say that 2,4-D and dicamba would be 2 of those that are most common. And so I tell people when they grow grapes, you better start liking dandelions and clover and things like that in your lawn, because what we use to kill dandelions and clover within a lawn are things like 2,4-D and dicamba. Those are growth regulating herbicides. And so you just really cannot, your neighbors, my neighbors all know I have grapes and they've been wonderful. But if a grapevine gets a strong dose, it could potentially reduce your crop, particularly if it happens before bloom, before fruit set. Afterwards, it might just ding the plant up, so you never want to have drift, but for grapes, it's better if it happens after your fruit is set than beforehand. But I'm going to just say in general, if you're going to grow grapes, you're not going to be using any of those types of Weed Be Gone is an example of one of the products that contains a lot of these types of herbicides.
And speaking of setting fruit, are grapes kind of like apples where you have to have cultivars cross-pollinate, or will they self-pollinate themselves?
I'm going to say by and large, most of those are self-pollinating. There are a few exceptions that need something to cross-pollinate. It's not real common, and usually it's quite, visible on the product tag that it needs something cross-pollinate. So there are a couple out there that are available for sale, but by and large, most of them will self-pollinate.
So let your neighbors know that you plan to share grapes with them if they don't spray their lawn right next to them. And that's a really good incentive, I think. I'll deal with the dandelion and clover if I can get some Elizabeth's table grapes.
Well, I think it kind of helps that, the new trend is a healthier lawn, is one that is
Mhm.
a mixed species. And so I think there are still some that, have the beautiful emerald grass lawns, but I think they're starting to catch on that mixed species is better for biodiversity. So it helps us with grapes as well.
Yep. So if we could go into our Wayback Machine and think about all of the questions you've received, Elizabeth, about grapes and mistakes, what would you say is the most common mistake that new grape growers make?
Well, I can do it at different staging. The first one is picking something that's just not a good choice. It's either not cold hardy enough or it has such severe, susceptibility to disease they can't keep the plants alive. So there's step one. Do your due diligence. But I think the other one is at planting. Grapes don't compete well against weeds at all. And so they need to have for at least their first 5 years of establishment a completely vegetation-free zone below the vines. And so even if you're just planting one, let's just say that you have, a patio arbor and you're just planting one, it needs to have at the base of the vine a completely vegetation free. And we usually, say 1.5 to 2 feet, you know, in all directions at the base needs to be
Hmm.
for the first 5 years. And I don't think that people realize how seriously the plant is set back when it's in a competitive situation with, weeds, or if they, get a great idea to plant ornamentals or something at the base. I've been hearing all these things, about biodiversity. Well, not all plants play well nice with others, and grapes are one that just does not do well with competition. So bare ground. So that's probably the second thing that I see. The third thing I see is failure to fertilize. Um, I don't know where the mindset or how it's gotten out that grapes don't need to be fertilized, but they do. They might not need to be fertilized, as much as some crops, but they do need. And you can always look at a grapevine and know whether it's struggling. And I always tell people that the tendrils on the plant are kind of like your gas pedal. Right now, if I were looking at tendrils, if they didn't extend beyond the tip of the plant, we're in active growth phase. Those tendrils should be beyond the tip of the, cane. And if they're not, I would immediately be saying you need to fertilize those vines. They don't have enough going for them. It's not until you get a real strong fruit crop on there does that kind of slow down on there. So fertility is probably the other thing, and it's usually nitrogen um, that is needed.
I recall it was you, and we also had Dr. Brad Taylor with SIU Carbondale came out and we toured a couple vineyards, and I really saw, the plants that were struggling had a lot of weed competition. You and him were both saying like you got to do something about these plants at the base of these grapevines. Like that really was very telling. Like it really drove home the message to me.
Right.
So
And
mulch, could you just
well,
mulch the base of the plant?
yeah, in a home setting, and as I said, I'm a home, grape grower, and I just use mulch to help keep, all that under control. In a commercial setting, that's not something that they would normally do it in that manner. But for a home setting, that works beautifully.
All right, so you talked a little bit about after planting and getting that training done. So after we've got all the scaffolding and all that, the cordons and all that set, what does the kind of the yearly pruning look like once you kind of got that plant established?
Yeah, once you've got the actual architecture of the plant set up, there are two basic ways to prune. As I said, there are entire books on training methods. Well, there's a couple of different. There's cane pruning, and there's also spur pruning. And I'm going to say, by and large, in Illinois, most of our pruning is spur pruning. And so, what a spur is just, when I told you in year 3, those canes that drop down will form your first crop. Well, the next dormant season, you would cut those canes down to short little shoots, maybe this long. And we call those spurs. And after that, that is where all of the canes are going to come from. So you're kind of creating a semi-permanent placement of where all your canes are going to come off. And so, as I said, each spur should be about Elizabeth's knuckle distance on both sides of the cordon. And we usually on every spur, I'm going to say in general, 2 canes will come off of that. And so, if you kind of keep in mind that grapes are born on buds formed the previous year, that they're not born on older wood, that's, I think that might be number 4 on what home gardeners do wrong is they don't prune enough. The plant should really look like a stick almost when you're done. The trunk, the cordon with little stubs all over the place. And I think it's difficult, maybe scary. Maybe that's too an excessive of a word, but it makes them nervous to cut that much off of the grapevine. But if you just keep in mind that they're much like peaches in that you have to preserve so much of last year's wood to get this year's crop. They're not like apples. You can prune too much off and really, severely hit your wood. So that's why we have cordons and little spurs on there so that you kind of have set up for year after year. Once you have it set up, it's fairly easy. And I guess that kind of leads me into the 5th mistake is not realizing that all parts need to be replaced at some point on a grapevine. Nothing is permanent. Let's say that you've got a grapevine and you get freeze injury. Let's just say we get some crazy freak freeze injury and the trunk gets injured. And all of a sudden the trunk starts shooting up, you know, um, new canes because there's an injury and all the old growth just kind of looks sick. It's just not growing well. Well, do you keep that sick vine that's been injured by freeze, or do you start, hey, I'm going to take this new shoot that's coming up and start training it up, and I'm going to re-trunk this tree, this vine, and record on it. It might take some time. But I think, as an experienced grape grower, that's when you recognize if you've got blind wood on a cordon, non-productive area, you don't leave it that way. You just take a nice little shoot, you lay it in, tie it down, and eventually you can cut off, that place that doesn't have production. So always remember all parts of a grapevine eventually will be replaced. I think they get this, in their mindset. It's like, oh, I've seen these 100-year-old vines. Well, it's not a 100-year-old vine. Maybe the root system's been in the ground that long, but it's probably been retrunked many, many times over those 100 years. Just nobody told them that.
Oh, that sounds so you would be making a major commitment. I know a few people that have like built an entire trellis over their patio to train grapes.
Yeah.
And oh, if you got hit by a late freeze or something, whew, you're
Yeah.
you're starting over.
And it is, and that's what I, tell gardeners or beginners that you always need to be kind of preserving extra parts. Like don't clean up the base of the trunk so much, always have, something in reserve in case something goes wrong because you're ahead of the game. Keeping some spare parts on there. And so, we can have freeze injury, sometimes disease sneaks in on you and you have to make the sacrifice of saying, I've got wood injury to disease and I've got to cut it away and you need to lay something else in. Plant's still alive. You just need to do something to, lay in some new cordon or start a new trunk.
All right, well, let's dive into the meaty topic of pest insects and disease. Now, you mentioned Elizabeth, primarily we're focused on disease. I know like Japanese beetles and things can get on grapes, but in a backyard, I feel like it'd be pretty easy just to do the old, pick them off, soapy water thing. There are some insecticides that you could spray for Japanese beetles. I know that's a pretty common one, but it's really disease that seems to be the thing that is the why most people call me, at least, like, what is this issue with my grape? Disease usually, and often I'm just like, I don't know. So send it to the plant clinic because the grapes are complicated in my eyes. So help me out here, Elizabeth. What should we be watching out for,
Well,
insect and disease wise?
I guess I can't say it enough. Do your research, and make sure that you don't invite a problem, because if all the experts who have been evaluating these grapevines say that, XYZ is super sensitive to XYZ, you're not special. It will come to get you eventually. That's just a reality. So, for those that are listening that have grapevines and have, struggled with disease, um, what is nice is if you have one and you're controlling it, you're basically controlling all of those if you do a good job. And so I tell people that we have two control points for fruit protection. So that doesn't mean I'm not talking about the leaves and stuff. I'm talking about if you want fruit, there are two critical time periods that you need to protect. And one of them, is late dormant. I mean, like very late dormant. If you're standing out there and you're like, oh, I think those buds are starting to swell, that's when you want to do your late dormant, as late as possible. And we do that for diseases called anthracnose. And that's something like a copper spray or a liquid lime sulfur. So there is a critical control point right there. The next one is immediate pre-bloom, and you're on a spray cycle for about 4 to 6 weeks after bloom. That means going in every 2 weeks. If you don't have a wash-off event, then you'd have to add some sprays. But that is the critical period to protect the fruit so that the fruit is not going to get black rot. It helps with anthracnose and phomopsis as well. And so you're controlling several diseases. I think, Chris and Ken, the tricky thing is what products do you need for controlling, these? And it's very specific for grapes, because when you're looking at pesticides, you need to have not only an effective pesticide, but you need one that's labeled for grapes. And you need to be able to apply it within, the pre-harvest interval or the PHI. All food crops have, a PHI for their pesticides. And so when I've already mentioned that the dormant period, you need to have either copper or liquid lime sulfur. And there are a number of, if you grow fruit crops, you probably have that, because that's a dormant application for a lot of things like peaches and apples as well. And so, there are other crops that you'll use that for. But when we look at grapes, they have two diseases that are not controlled by the normal fungicide, that we use in vegetable crops. A real common would be chlorthalonil, the active ingredient. That does not have any activity on black rot or powdery mildew. It does absolutely nothing. And so if you use, your traditional fungicide on grapes, it just isn't going to help you out at all. And so when we look at grapes, it's really important to know what is effective. And so for black rot, something, that has the active ingredient mancozeb is very effective for black rot. So you need to source that. And I think Ortho and Bonide probably both make a mancozeb product that you mix with water and spray on. So that's your early season spray. There is another product that is made by Spectracide. It's called Spectracide Immunox. I think it's general purpose. And the active ingredient is myclobutanil. And that is very effective, again, against black rot and powdery mildew. And so that's the next one that you need. So mancozeb and the Spectracide Immunox for grapes. So for grapes, you're going to get some very specific, not general, very specific, and they're available not as readily. So you might have to do some looking around ahead of time to make sure that you've got a supply of it. But I also, for late season, because I mentioned a PHI, Mancozeb has a 77-day PHI. So you can use it early season to get you through that black rot window, but then you need to stop. And then what can you spray after that? And that's when Cap 10 comes in. And so again, that's why people should be thinking, oh gosh, that seems like an awful lot of work. That's why I go back to do your research and find something that's not quite so susceptible to all these diseases, because it will really reduce how much, pesticide applications you have to do. And that kind of moves me to someone always asks me, I want to grow these organically. In Illinois, black rot is our Waterloo. We do not have an effective organic product for black rot. And so if you want to grow organically, it is critical that you do your research and find something that is not, susceptible to black rot. You need to find one that has slightly susceptible to give yourself a fighting chance to grow grapes. And that's just my comment on that. All the other ones you can probably find an organic solution, for, but black rot is the one that we do not have a good organic solution for.
Uh, what family is the grapes in? What plant family?
It's Vitus.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that it's just its own
Its
family.
own, its own. Mhm.
Yeah,
Okay.
look that up while we're talking.
Yes.
Looking right now. You'd think I'd know that, but I think it's its own family.
Vitaceae.
Yeah, Vitaceae.
Vitaceae. Okay. I was like, all right, I got a clue. It's in my brain operates in plant families sometimes, so I gotta plop it in its own little category in my head.
Sometimes that's important to know.
Hmm.
Make kind of relationships to other plants.
Hmm. That's how I do a tree fruit. I'm like, oh yeah, like that's in the rose family. So this is the suite of diseases that we're dealing with here.
Yeah, with the rose family, you immediately know fire blight is a
Hmm.
possibility because it's
Yep.
restricted to the rose family. It's Japanese beetle, or one of those again that you usually think of them restricted to the rose family, but man, when it comes to grapes, they love grapes. And I will say, we talked about establishment. That is, a mature grapevine can take quite a bit of feeding, um, on the leaves. You definitely don't want them on your fruit. When they start going to your fruit, then you better get in there, as Chris said, and start knocking them off into soapy water and drowning them. But on young grapevines that you've just planted, they can totally defoliate them in a quick hurry, and so can deer. Um, Deer are a serious pest if freshly planted, and so whenever I've planted new grapevines, I do my cheap version of just hardware cloth bent around a wood stick so that there's some protection, because a deer will go after them immediately.
So if someone's got a vine that's not producing fruit, I guess it's going to depend on why it's not fruiting, but what should they do to rectify that?
Well, one of the first questions I ask is this a prune grapevine? And usually it's one of two things. It needs fertility is one of the possibilities, but the other thing is usually pruning, and that it needs to be brought back into a fruiting state. Like many plants, if they're overly vigorous and in a vegetative state, in too much shading on itself, then it's not fruitful and you don't get enough crop. And so usually the first thing I say is, have you run a soil test so that we can see, whether there needs to be a bump up in fertilizer, but it usually has something to do with pruning. Then it needs to have a lot removed to open it up to sunshine and make it more fruitful.
So if somebody's got a grapevine that hasn't been pruned in a while, like kind of like tree fruit, you do that over a period of time to get it back under control. So the same thing with grapes, or can we just you kind of hack it back and done?
Yeah, no, you can turn it into what it needs to be, right from with apples we usually, say, one to two big cuts, and a big cut would be anything you can't use your loppers on. Anything that you need to have a pruning saw or chainsaw is a big cut. So, one, maybe two. But grapes, no, you need to get them turned around right away. And that's where, if you've got a grapevine that hasn't been pruned, you really need to study all the parts first to see if what was the initial cordon is already kind of in sad shape, whether the trunk is in sad shape, because you might be in a situation where you're just cutting the entire trunk and preserving one of those new canes coming up and starting all over. So I will say, kind of evaluate the situation. I was in a commercial vineyard just recently, and the recommendation was to cut them all off and start over the whole entire vineyard. It was in bad enough shape that, they bought an existing vineyard that had not been cared for, and that's what they did. And grapes, as I say, are kind of like weeds. They'll take off and go on you.
Well, I see this trend happening quite a bit. We have our patio blueberries and tomatoes. You don't have to trellis these things. You don't have to worry about too much maintenance or care. So low maintenance. And actually, my county director, she had purchased some of these grapevines, mini grapevines or something. She thought, oh, I could just plant this and just leave it alone. I might know the answer to this already, but Elizabeth, are there any grapes that we can just plant and forget some low maintenance ones?
Well, I'm probably going to give a wishy-washy answer to this, because when we're growing a fruit plant, not just grapes, we usually are highly manipulating them towards our desire for a crop. And so I think there needs to be an understanding that we can pretty much walk away from any plant, and let it do its own thing, and it doesn't need us on there. You know, what my takeaway on that is you have to think about, is it susceptible to disease? Because that might come back and bite you, if you just walk away and it was susceptible. But one of the other things that usually happens when you just walk away and we're not manipulating it with pruning, and combing down cordons and keeping everything straight and exposed to the sun, is that we don't have as much yield. And so I can say, yes, if something happens in your life and you have to walk away from it, usually the plant is not going to die, but you might not get the yield potential, of that one or two vines that you would have otherwise gotten.
I guess that makes sense too. Like you can walk away. These plants aren't necessarily going to just die right away if we stop paying attention to them. Like there's a grower I work with her, and she's got Concord grapes that came with the farm. And I don't think she really does anything to them, but she just harvests them as much as she can and makes maybe a gallon or two of grape juice every year out of it.
And, even when I talk about, apples, in a commercial setting, we've come up with all this research because the whole goal is to be sustainable and make a profit. When we are home gardening, that's not necessarily our goals, on things. And so, if I give an example of having an apple tree, that reaches out and, gets you every time you try to mow it, a homeowner, is more likely to go in there and, lop that limb off to make life, a little bit easier for them to mow. And I think, a lot of home growing has to be somewhat adjusted to a home environment, for that reason.
Yes. All right. So we've weathered the storm with our pests and diseases. Our grapes are ready to pick. How do we know when to pick them?
Well, for homeowners that don't have the equipment, I mean, there's obviously, you can buy a refractometer, and measure the bricks, and pick at a certain bricks. And that's how winemakers do it. I mean, they actually are looking at specific bricks. But for a homeowner like me, I go out and, I sample. and I sample on the shade side, on the north side of the trellis. I sample on the south side of the trellis. I sample at the tip of the cluster, and I sample at the shoulder. When it tastes good to me, that's when I harvest. So I always tell people, don't go on color, because they go through veraison, and that's the coloring phase, a lot sooner than they're truly ripe, before they have built their sugar content and before they have their full flavor profile. And so it really is a go out and taste them and see if they're ready to go. Now, there are, not to muddy the waters, but I guess I am, there are some American varieties like Edelweiss that, we always talk about American grapes having a foxy flavor to them or a muskiness. Well, Edelweiss is one that is super musky, almost to the point of, distasteful. And so it is kind of one of those exceptions that we harvest it before it's fully ripe. And so it's an exception. Otherwise, I would just say do it on taste.
I guess if you go out and you harvest, are there any methods for like storing or preserving the grapes that we harvest? I suppose refrigeration or fermentation, but yeah, how do we store these things that we've harvested?
Yeah, grapes are usually good in the refrigerator for about 2 weeks. If you've harvested them in good condition, there's not some underlying fruit rot. You know how fruit is. If there's one bad berry, it can
Hmm.
spread. So assuming that you have, done a good job of cleaning, they'll store in the refrigerator for you to be able to decide, what you're going to do with them. In my home, I grow, like I say, Sunbelt, which is a Concord style. When I harvest, I immediately go into pressing, because these grapes, anything that you're going to chill, is going to precipitate out the tartrate acid in there. And so you'll have, I've supplied you a picture for that, to see that. But we call those wine diamonds. And so tartrate acid is what gives grapes their flavor. It's part of the flavor profile. But one of the distracting things is when you squeeze the juice and it gets chilled down, they precipitate out, and we call them wine diamonds. And so it's totally safe to, ingest these crystals, but it's not really that palatable. And so when I bring in my grapes, first thing I do is I press them, and then I just stick them in the refrigerator for, at least a day, to get those to precipitate out. And then I filter them out just through cheesecloth. And then I, go through whatever I'm going to use it, jams, jellies, or just juice. But I think that is one thing that you've got about a 2-week window to decide what you're going to do with your grapes, if you're just going to eat them fresh, or if you're going to actually, juice them out and make wines or jams or jellies or something like that. But be aware of wine diamonds. And we call that, uh, gosh, I just had a senior moment. Cold stabilization, sorry, by putting it in the refrigerator to force that to happen. I don't know if you've ever had grape juice that hasn't been cold stabilized before it was put in the jar. They maybe went through the canning process and then they stick it in the refrigerator, and all of a sudden there's just this white layer at the bottom. Those are all those crystals that have formed that you kind of avoid pouring in your glass. And so by doing it ahead of time, you can avoid that. Again, it's all safe. It's part of the grape that we normally eat, but it's that chilling that causes it.
So there are some diamonds we don't want. Okay.
Yeah, there's some diamonds.
All right. So we'll wrapping up here. And we didn't ask you at the beginning, what is your preferred method of eating grapes? Table, raisin, fermented juice?
I'm an equal opportunity. I keep raisins on hand at all times. They go into every salad. I eat a lot of curries. They're in I mean, I cook with them, so they're in. We have grapes and fresh grapes in the refrigerator as well, but grape juice is one of our favorite. Either I made it or we buy it when we run out. So I'm gonna, and I definitely imbibe it, fermented as well. And so I just am an equal opportunity. I don't know that I have a favorite one over the other. I just thoroughly enjoy them.
All right. And I guess, do you have a favorite grape variety? Like you can only grow one type of grape variety. What would it be and why?
Oh, it has to be a Concord. I've been ruined as a child, growing up with Welch's Cooperative. The rest of the world outside of the United States, just is appalled that we eat American grapes. That foxiness is a total fault, and that might be, but I have an acquired palate for it. I will always love it. I love it as juice. I love it, sparkling, and I love it fermented. And so I think that I would always have a Concord grape. My second one is anything that has, the Muscat heritage in it. I really like that flavor. And there are a lot of options of Muscat flavoring too in table grapes and wine grapes. So if people like Muscat, there are several. If you look at something like Neptune table grape, which is very suited to Illinois, seedless, it has that Muscat background flavor that is very desirable to a lot of people, that nice sweetness, almost a cloying sweetness, but good. But I'm going to say a Concord type, like what I grow, Sunbelt. I mentioned,
Well,
I'll mention that I grow Sunbelt. One of the problems with Concord as you move to a warmer climate is it does not ripen evenly. And so it has green berries. And so that's why Sunbelt was developed, was to have more uniform ripening in a warm climate. So that's why I have that instead of the straight Concord.
hopefully my grape trepidation has not scared anyone off of growing this, because now at the end of the show I feel like I could do this again. So Elizabeth, do you have any parting words for someone like me or someone listening or watching that is going to be starting their grape growing journey?
Disease resistance, disease resistance, disease resistance.
Hmm.
There's nothing, and I think we can all disagree or agree on this, is there's nothing more disappointing than to have disease take out your plant and just struggle to get it under control, particularly, if you don't have the time or the inclination to be, spraying, every other week, if not more for it. So I'm going to say, do your homework, and you can find some varieties out there that are very good, that almost seem like you can walk away if it weren't for the pruning requirements.
Well, that was a lot of great information about growing grapes in your very own backyard. Well, the Good Growing Podcast is a production of University of Illinois Extension, edited this week by Ken Johnson. And a special thank you to our special guest today, Dr. Elizabeth Wahle. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being on the show today. It's always so great to have you here and to learn from your vast amount of grape growing knowledge as of today that we got. Thank you.
As always, it was a pleasure, gentlemen.
Thank you. And Ken, thank you very much for being here, editing, and also, growing the grapes.
Yes.
Do you grow grapes, Ken?
I don't, but after today, like you, I feel more confident now. So maybe sometime down the line, when I have more time, I'll try.
Next year.
Yes, and thank you, Elizabeth, as always. It's great having you on. And Chris, let's do this again next week.
Oh, we shall do this again next week. It's milkweed, the plant of the year for 2025. We'll talk all about Asclepias, that genus. There's many different species out there I think we can cover. So we are going to be discussing milkweed next week. So listener, thank you for doing what you do best, and that is listening. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, watching. And as always, keep on growing.